I think there's a danger of seeing money and banking as evil. I'd remember it was the love of money, it was the root of all evil, not money itself. And if you see a lot of little clips and little cartoons and on the web, quite often there's a kind of sense of the evil banker, the goldsmith, and there's such a danger of this, of having a kind of conspiracy theory and therefore getting quite reactionary sort of attitudes towards people. And yes, it is true that the people who have been participating in that system have benefited hugely, and we know that, the bonus culture. And there is greed, there is perhaps lack of awareness among many people. They're just having a good time and making a lot of money, and of course many of them are very young. It's a young person's game. But what I want us to do is to understand the flaws in the system in order to achieve effective change, not just be angry and bitter about what all these people are doing. Right, the starting point for banking then is banking is very old. It emerged in Egyptian and Babylonian times, well, as I reminded you last week, well before coinage, gold, silver coinage, which came thousands of years later. So we're talking huge historical periods. And the original form of banking, I think the oldest form of money really is in accountancy. I think accountancy perhaps is the second oldest profession. Based on records, and you had to have accountancy because you stored things collectively. You stored your grain in silos to keep the rats out and difficulties like that. And you had water systems which were collective, and you had cattle which all ran together. So you needed some record of who owned what. You didn't have little fences, so everybody had their own little plot. Things were held collectively, and therefore if you were the owner of a certain proportion of the cattle, then you wanted it, your record, or you put your grain into the silo. So the early hieroglyphics were really records of ownership and of payments or obligations such as taxes and other forms of debt. And you could use these records as exchange in settlement of debts or payment for goods. And the relative values are very interesting because one of the standard measures was 24 grains of barley. And of course, the old money we used to have was 24 pence in the pound. 240 pence in the pound. And so really our money system wasn't British, it was Egyptian. And which gives a whole new sense of internationalism. Hold on. Ownership then was exchanged through the banking system was a kind of gyro system which transferred ownership and records so people could transfer them. And the earliest banking code, in fact, which was part of a larger code, was the Code of Hammurabi, which is 1770 BCE, not AD, BC. And people have translated these early rules about conduct and how you behaved with borrowers, lenders, and payment of interest. And the important thing to remember at that stage is the accounting was much more important than whatever passed for the money transfer. So you would have accounts of ownership and transfer debts payments. That's much more important than the actual thing you transferred in settlement of whatever it was you agreed the relative values, or in settlement of an injury payment, or in settlement of a marriage, or whatever it might be. So what's a bank? Well, banks do lots of things if you think about contemporary banks. Obviously somewhere to keep your money safe, a means of transferring money around, a lender of money, a discounter of debts, I'll explain all these things later, an underwriter for investments, banks can be a business themselves, borrowing and investing on their own account, proprietary trading. And these functions can be separated into different kinds of banks, or they can be combined into the universal banks. So basically, there's a range of activities that a bank can do, and there's probably more than my list. But banks also create money. This is the core of what we're talking about today. And this famous phrase, which you'll see written everywhere by John Kenneth Galbraith, the process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled. And so that's what we want to talk about. How do banks create money? The point I wanted to make, and I think this is the point is missed in nearly all the discussions of money, it doesn't just appear in society, it has to be issued. And I think every time I hear money discussed, I never really hear where did money come from, which was the question we started with last week. Where does money come from? It's assumed just to appear magically in society, it just is. And we know now from our discussion last time that historically states have issued money, and in various forms, from cash, notes, coin, to tally sticks, to notes of debts, etc. And banks have issued money as discounts on financial exchanges, that is paying out ahead of future payment, which I'll explain a little more in a minute, or as direct loans. So they issue money as loans, or they issue money as indirect loans when they help traders out. So basically, money must be issued in society, and there are at least two major organisations that can issue money and do issue money: states and banks, or rulers if you haven't got a formal state. What we're told about banks is largely an illusion. If I asked you to think what a bank is, you would probably think, well, they take in deposits and they lend it out. They take your money in and they lend it out to people who want it. And this is what you're told in all the textbooks. They take in people's money and they lend it out at interest. And they're intermediaries. They're just doing a service. They're just uniting the borrowers and the savers. But the problem with that is that when you take your money to the bank and put it in, you expect that money is available to you whenever you want it. Even your savings, what we call time deposits, so things you've left in for 3 months, you can still say, I'll forego my interest, I'll get it out now. And if you ask for it, and even 3 months, 6 months, it's not very long in terms of loan terms. If you think a mortgage is 25 years or 30 years or 40 years these days, then your little bit of time you've promised to leave your money there, 6 months or 9 months, isn't much on 40 years. So the question that John Kenneth Galbraith asked is, well, how can money be in two places at once? How can it always be available to the depositor and yet be lent out to the borrower? And anyway, where did the deposit come from in the first place? When people take their money to the bank to deposit it, well, where did that money come from? So these are the kind of circular questions we ask about where money comes from. Now, the way we link deposits and the idea of borrowing the deposits was because we're back to the gold story again. If you read textbooks about this, then you'll get this kind of what I would say was almost a folk history, but it's not the real situation. But anyway, it's a folk history. People deposited gold and silver. Well, the question I would ask is, where did they get that from? Did they go over and dig it out themselves from South America? So they take their gold and silver along, and they get a record of deposit. They get a note to say they've left it in, as the old banking system going right back did. The theory is the gold and silver is then lent out to other people at interest, but that is difficult because it's a physical thing gone. So in fact, the banks, the theory is the banks later on decided not to actually let the gold go out, but let a piece of paper go out. So you've got two pieces of paper. You've got the depositor who'd left the gold, who's got a piece of paper saying there's £100 worth of gold there, and you've got the borrower who says, I've borrowed £100 worth of gold. And so you've got £200 out there and £100 of gold in there. That's the way it's presented in the theory. And then if you read the textbooks don't say this, but sometimes the people on the web say it who've got their little cartoons. They say, then bankers cheated. Bankers cheated because they created much more paper than gold. They lent money they didn't have. And this was the origin of this thing called fractional reserve banking. You have a lot of paper out there from the depositors and the borrowers, and if they all came for their money at once, they couldn't get it. But you hope they don't come at once. They only come in dribs and drabs, and therefore you can eke the money out between them all. This is the kind of theory of that notion of banking. Now, the assumption behind that is that the real money, the only real money here, is the gold and silver at the end, and all the paper is just so much cheating, really. And that is the kind of story that you're told quite often. And I just don't go along with this, because I don't think that's how banking emerged at all, because if we think about it, we know that banking was much older than the gold and silver and coins anyway. That banking's been going on for 2,000 years, and records of deposits and exchanging of bits of paper saying, I owe you this, you owe me this, you pay me in 12 months, you pay me this, you pay me an extra sheet when you pay me back in 12 months' time. So we know that records have been much more important historically than something physical. So let's look at another less sort of alarmist history of banking. Look at commercial banking, because really the modern banking system is about commerce and trade. That's what it's all about, and to a certain extent as well, states. European banks emerged in the early medieval Italy, serving states, traders and the rich. For most of their history, banks weren't banks for the poor. And something that helped in that period was the adoption of double-entry bookkeeping, which was much clearer a way of transferring, recording transfers of payment. Now, true, the banks also did safe storage of precious money and other valuables, which they did record on notes of deposit, that's true. And all the early banking system was based on, both for the depositors, the bankers, and the borrowers, was all a system based on personal trust, on the bond between the bankers, the traders, etc. So the notion of the bond, which is still very much with us today, goes way back. Now, what happened was that the notes circulated widely, and this obviously expanded the money supply. The more traders there were, the more people there were who were getting notes of deposit, who were getting notes of promissory notes of loans, and then trading them between each other. So as the activity goes, so the supply of these notes starts to proliferate. Rulers were borrowing because one of the things that has made it difficult for rulers was, in fact, the adoption of precious metal money, because that was in short supplies, and therefore rulers couldn't manufacture their own money if they were trying to manufacture coin, because they did need to have the metal to do it. So they were borrowing metal and paper money, using it particularly to fund wars, and often defaulted. So a number of early bankers were ruined by rulers not paying up. So the way that they did the commercial banking was this discounting, which is very much a feature of modern banking. And basically what happens is, if a trader, if trader 1 gives a load of goods to trader 2, and trader 2 says, well, I will now go and travel abroad and sell these goods, and when I come back I will pay you, trader 1, with the money I get from having sold your goods, and gives a promissory note back to trader 1 to say, I will come back and I will pay you, and it's all done on trust that they will. But trader 1 can't wait. Trader 1 wants the money now. So that's where the bank comes in. The bank takes the note that trader 2 has given to trader 1 from trader 1 and gives the trader 1 the bank's note, which is much more able to be circulated, or coinage if the trader 1 wants coinage, and so the bank pays out straight away, and then but pays at a discount, because obviously that's their profit on having given the trader 1 the money straight away. The bank waits and gets the full amount off trader 2 when the trader comes back and has sold all the goods, and then the bank is paid off, and that is what discounting is all about. And banks also enabled external trade through bills of exchange, because of course different parts of the world were using different currencies, and or paper notes that are issued in London won't necessarily be accepted in Genoa. So what you do is you get a banker to interact for you. So the banker will take payment in London and pay you out in Genoa. So bills of exchange were very important to early trading. You had to have a means. And another thing where a lot of the banking came from, of course, was the Crusades, and that was often done through things like the Knights Templar, which were deposits of money to pay out as you went through. But all of these were important to have family networks across countries, because if somebody's paying out in London and you're paying out in Genoa, then you want to trust the person who's taking the money or paying out in London. So it's better if they're your brother or somebody you know very well. And this, of course, is how you get the family conspiracy ideas, the ideas of there's a network of these cheating bankers all over the world. They had to be networks. They had to be family networks, because who else can you trust when you're going across the globe? So banks became major lenders to rulers and to traders, people like the Medici, the Rothschild, Barings, all different religions. So bankers came from all parts of the religious spectrum, and that's very, very important to remember. We then have national banks getting set up, and our own national bank, 1694, picking up on the accountancy, the double entry bookkeeping, the notion of banknotes, setting up a national bank. And it was set up in England to fund the war against France, and King William, wasn't it, at that point, and lent $1 million or so at 8%, which is quite high interest rates. What they're complaining about now are the interest rates. So that would break the bank in Italy, I think, if you were at 8%. But the big change with the Bank of England was the merchant bankers who came together to lend the money to the state said, we're not trusting the king, we will only trust Parliament. So in fact, they lent to Parliament, and that's the beginning of the national debt. Why didn't the king then issue his own money? Well, basically, I've already mentioned the problem that if you do base your currency on gold and silver, whoever holds that gold and silver become very powerful. And that wasn't necessarily the monarchs. They didn't hold the gold and silver. Often the metal had gone abroad, and there were massive shortages of it anyway for long periods. So you couldn't get hold of it because every country wanted gold and silver coinage. And the crown could not use its own money in any other form, such as the tally sticks, because it's run out of credit, literally, meaning it's run out of anybody belief that the crown will pay its debts. So it's lost its trust with the population and the people who pay the taxes. So he had no choice. I just thought you'd be interested in how the national debt goes up and down. And it comes with wars, doesn't it? The wars ending in 1816, 237% of GDP. Just before the First World War, 25% of GDP. After the First World War, 135% of GDP. 37 after the crash and difficulties, 150%. Post-war, 238%. 25% in 1992. Pre-crisis, just before the crisis, we were doing very well. We were at 40%, and most of Europe was at 40% of GDP. Post-crisis, it's jumped dramatically, but it would only be 60% for us if we excluded the cost of the bailout. But look at the other countries, all this hoo-ha about the national debt, which at the moment is about maximum 80% for us. Japan has national debt of 200% of GDP. Singapore, which is meant to be one of the great trading countries, 105% of GDP. So basically, what we're talking about here, it's scare tactics, because we're not talking about anything very huge. And look at the interest rates. 1920, 7% interest rates was 7%. Interest rates 5% forming 5% of GDP. Sorry, I shouldn't have said GDP there. Interest rates at 7%, interest rates at 5%. At the moment, interest rates is between 2 and 4%. And at the moment, a lot of the lending is at negative interest rates because everybody's so doubtful where their money will be safe. They're pouring it into states, into the US and Germany and Britain, trying to find somewhere to put their money. So what about all this fear of national debts and deficits then? Well, the deficit is just you spend more than you take in tax. Now, if you take my view of the state issuing money and re-taxing, then that would always appear to be in deficit, because my argument was if the state puts out money and then takes it all 100% back in tax, there's no money left in the economy. And even when they taxed heavily, as in the colonies, they only taxed at 60%. So if you think of money being issued first and then the taxation being a recall of that money, then that explains how a deficit emerges, because it's only called a deficit if you think the tax comes first and the expenditure comes second. So it depends which way round you look at it, the way you see it. We're hearing a lot at the moment about a structural deficit. Well, I've looked for definitions of structural deficit, and I think the nearest one you can get is it's just one that persists. That it's not just something that you can put your finger on exactly why it's happened. And is that a problem? Is it the problem if the national debt is going up? And yes, it is, if the state is seen as a household who borrows externally, that is, borrows in a currency they don't control. But it's not a problem if the state uses its money creation power to monetize the debt rather than borrow. And that's the circuit I described last week, the issue of money and then the taxing back of the money. Then it wouldn't be a problem. Japan doesn't have a problem. Japan is 200%. It doesn't have a problem because 95% of its borrowings are internal. So it's borrowing off its own people, creating its own money, circulating it among its own people. So it's not a problem. It's been like this for a lot of years, a couple of decades now. So what happened to this history of banking then? The bankers are issuing all these notes, these trading notes, and they're circulating. The banks have issued. People trust the banknotes. They'll take them because they know that the Medici will always pay out or the Rothschild will always pay out. So what happens is, over time, those banknotes, the credit and debts that the banks are passing through, become tied up, become accepted as money themselves. That is, people will accept a Rothschild note. They will say, well, Rothschild will always pay out, so we'll take, if you give us a Rothschild note, we'll believe in it. And so they stopped having to have such a personal bond between the trader, the banker, and the debtors and the creditors. They would just trust the bank itself. But of course, banks still failed. And eventually, it got so that the state began to take responsibility for the banking system in terms of bank failures. So state money, the notes and coin issued by the state, came together with the bank paper when the banknotes were made national tender. The banks could only issue an authorised banknote. It couldn't just be the bank's own note. It had to be an authorised banknote, and that was backed by a cash guarantee by the state, and that's why your banknotes all say, I promise to pay. So what happened was the Bank of England, which until 1946 was a private company, a private organisation, was given the monopoly of the issue of banknotes on the which were printed by the Royal Mint and sold to the Bank of England to issue to banks. So banks bought, for their notes, the banks bought the banknotes off the central bank, and so that's how the bank notes get out into the population. So we've got this distinction then. Again, if you come to your textbooks, you'll find a distinction between real money and bank money. Somehow there's something that was real money, but we're not quite sure quite what that was and where it came from. And then there's this thing called bank credit, which to do with the way banks can issue money. And somehow we've got to kind of put the two together. How do we do that? And this lies behind this illusion of the banking, that original deposits are real money, and that bank loans is something different. It's a credit money. It's something that isn't real money. So the question then is, where does real money come from? When you put your deposit in the bank, where does that come from? And the answer is, well, previously circulating money. It's the money you've got for your wages. It's the money you've got when you sold your house. You take it to the bank. But then you can just go one stage back. Well, where did that come from then? So you're tracing back. And in the end, you do come back to a theory of the state. Because although there's no concept of the state issuing money now, you won't get that sort of sense of the issue money and tax as a circuit. You will get the idea that somehow the state magically issues this real money. And this real money comes from the state via the central bank, and it's called in the textbooks, obviously, sometimes the base money, high-powered money, narrow money. But what exactly it is it cash? Do they mean notes and coin? Do they just mean the reserves of the bank system, or of the central bank system? Very unclear what is meant by this notion of real money. And there was a big dispute in the 19th century between what's known as the currency school, which argued that real money is only banknotes, authorised banknotes, legal tender, backed by gold. So this is where you get back to your gold idea and your gold backing. And the banking school, which was much more, said, look, money emerges through people trading with each other, taking out loans, trading with each other, and basically you shouldn't tie your banknote issue to anything other than how much activity there is in the economy. So the economy will call forth its own amount of banknotes that it needs, and therefore you've got to be flexible in your banking system. You can't just link it to something as external in a sense as gold, which depends on how much gold you've got, etc. In the 1844 Banking Act, the currency school won the battle because banknote issue was to be limited to a notion of gold, or amount of gold. But in fact, the banking school won the war because although the currency school got banknotes limited, you could only, I think it was £14 million you could be printed of banknotes. No more. It's a bit like the constraint on Obama at the moment. He's only allowed to have so much, is it £14 trillion worth of borrowing, and no more, as if somehow there's a magic number about which you don't go. But in fact, the banking school won the war because what they didn't stop when they stopped the banknotes being issued, they didn't stop the banks issuing electronic accounts. So it wasn't electronic then, it was just paper records, obviously. What you call sight accounts. That is money which you know there's a record of. So you're back to paper again. There's a record of how much money you've got, but you don't actually physically have it in pound notes. It just says in your bank is holding £100 for you. But you don't have £100 notes in your hand. So, and now, as we know, most money in the economy now is in the form of bank accounts. There's very little cash. And young people don't use cash. Even for spending £1.50, they'll get the debit card out. So really, cash has almost disappeared. Now, the theory, again, if you go to the textbooks, the theory is banks are allowed to issue multiples of this base money, whatever this base money is. And the usual idea is they're allowed to issue 10 times. So for how much base money the government, notes and coin, is that what they mean? Well, what they issue, the banks can issue 10 times that or 9 times that. Or put the other way around, if you deposit your money in the bank, they can lend out 90% of it, but they must keep 10% back. These kinds of ideas. But actually, how's that done? How does that happen? How does the state issue money that somehow the banks then magically issue 10% or keep back 10%? And the answer is, well, it doesn't really work like that. Because in fact, there isn't that direct relationship between some concept of state-issued money and some notion of how banks create money. Because banks create money not by taking in deposits and lending it out. Galbraith has already pointed that out. You can still get your money back. What the banks do is they take in your money, and they do give it back to you, but they also issue loans. And that issuing loan is an exercise in itself. They create a bank account, they create a deposit account in your name. You want to buy a £100,000 house, good if you can get one. The bank opens an account for you with £100,000 in it, and you write a cheque and it gets transferred. Now, of course, so every time they make a loan, they create new money by setting up a bank account. This money then, you go and buy the house, you take your £100,000 out, you go and buy the house, and then the person you bought the house off takes £100,000 to the bank, and then, my goodness me, this is new real money. Was it real money? But it looks like new real money, and so the banks. So this makes it look as if somehow there's a real money source, whereas in fact it was the money the bank lent you to buy the house in the first place that becomes the real money somebody gets from selling their house. So what's happening now is that there isn't really any relationship between state money and bank-issued money. As the banking school wanted it to be, the amount of money created depends on demand, the people and businesses and governments who want to borrow, and the bank's willingness to lend. So it's a negotiation between those who want money and the bank's willingness to create it. So therefore, effectively, the majority of money in our society It's loans created as sight accounts, which can be described as fresh air money or fountain pen money. That's what James Tobin called it in 1963, he of the Tobin tax. As I say, by the 1990s in this country, nearly all UK money was issued through the banking system. But it always had been, you see, that had been going on right back to the traders paying out from the banks, right back when they were discounting and bills of exchange. It wasn't new in that sense. It had been going on a long, long time. But now it's become a major part of our money supply system. And the states have attempted to control it. The whole monetarist thing that they tried to do, they tried to measure M1, M0, M1, M2, M3, M4, and they couldn't do it. They just couldn't control it. And it's been shown clearly that, in fact, the issuing of state money, notes and coin, follows the issue of bank money. It follows it because the banks lend the money, then people make a demand for cash, so then the banks go and buy it off the state, and they say, people want so much cash, can we buy it off you with our money? So the banks are the source of money there. Therefore, money issued as debt has always been central to capitalism, because it's always been what they've relied on to set up the productive circuit. You borrow your money, you set up your factory, or you buy your goods, then you go and trade them, and then you pay your debts back when you've done your circuit, your money circuit. So money for most of the history of money has been tied either to rulers taking it, or a lot of aristocracy gambled away their lands. The notion of the mortgage comes from the aristocracy frittering themselves with particularly obsession with gambling they had, so a lot of loans and things went on that. But the main growth recently, as we well know, has been personal loans, consumer loans, student loans, household loans, and a lot of money has been lent for financial speculation. James Robertson, who's got a book, The Future of Money, which is he's in the process of writing. I gave you his website last time. He looks at the money supply in this country from 1969 to 2009, and he said that if you look at how much increase in debt people were taking out, and you look at the increase in money supply, they're roughly the same. So basically, nearly all the money supply from 1969 onwards was basically people taking debt. And a lot of that was equity release, when people were taking out bigger mortgages and then spending it on goodness knows what. Now, the problem with debt-based money as the basis of your money supply is it's unstable. Because if all money is issued as debt that has to be repaid, and has to be repaid with interest, then in your total money supply, if everybody is repaying it and repaying it with interest, then where is the money to come from to pay the interest? There must be more money being issued constantly if you're going to be able to pay money and pay back more than you borrowed. So the money supply, therefore, has to constantly expand, and therefore it does constantly devalue. And over the last 20th century, the pound virtually lost all its value. So that's the other side of house price rises. It looks as if you've got a lot of money in your house, but in fact it means that your pounds don't go as far as when they were bought for £300 in the 1950s. And of course, if you've got debt-based money issue, then that drives also constant growth, because if you've borrowed money, then you've got to do something with it to earn the money to repay that debt you've got. So you have to do something. You have to have some economic activity to be able to pay that debt. If you've borrowed money to buy a house, you've got to find a way of making a living to pay the money back to buy the house. So debt-based money must expand the money supply constantly and must demand constant economic activity, hence this obsession with growth. We've got to grow, we've got to grow, we've got to grow. It's not because we want to give people more goods and services, it's because of the dynamics of it, is that we have to constantly increase our economic activity. And of course, this can all end in tears any time. People either get over-indebted and can't pay back, where we are now, of course, or the banks refuse to lend because they don't trust anybody to pay their loans back, and therefore you get a contraction of available money, which is where we are at the moment. We're in a contraction period. Those who have money certainly aren't going to lend it out to anybody. No, but the trouble is the banks do have a problem, Because over these years, there used to be a time when you paid for every cheque. You paid for your bank account. Now, not many people in this room will remember that happening, but you used to have to pay. But people have been led to think that every penny they've got is somehow an investment. It's all being used by the bank, and the bank is making money out of all that you've left, or out of your wages or whatever it's got. But it is true that banks must make a surplus or a profit. And if they do keep money back for a rainy day, if they do keep reserves or capital, that is retained profits and the original money they had to set the bank up, that's dead money. That doesn't make money for the bank. So therefore the impetus is to keep your reserves as low as possible. Until, of course, you get to the present stage where you don't trust anybody, and the European Central Bank has put out about 500 billion euros and has immediately got it back as the banks leave it with the European Central Bank overnight because they won't lend it to anybody. But in the good times, you want to keep as low reserves as possible. You want to lend. You want to create as many assets as possible. Assets are your loans and investments, which are long-term and can be risky, as people have found. The liabilities of the bank are short in terms of the money people take in. So people leave money with the bank, which they either want invested or they want the bank to look after. The assets the bank has are loans it's lent out and loans it's created. And but of course they are deposits. So it's not a case of the money coming in and going out there. The bank has promised money to a lot of people, and if they all come at once, yes, there will be trouble because the assets and the liabilities won't add up. So banks are always susceptible to a loss of confidence and a run. The notion of a reserve is meaningless in a crisis. 10%, 5%, 15%, 20%. What kind of reserve is going to keep people happy? So really, the idea of a reserve is not useful, because when it's needed, it's no good, it's not enough. So you've got liquidity and insolvency then, which we often talk about. Liquidity is the amount of cash or near cash available to the bank if people demand it, which is not necessarily in notes and coin, can come out in cheques, but it's how much on the bank's balance sheet they can actually access. And of course, if the banks have got money tied up and they can't access it, they can't get their loans in, then the central bank can lend them the money if necessary, and has been in the crisis, been lending the money over and over again at very cheap rates. Insolvency is when the assets of the bank, including the bank's own capital, the bank's own reserves, if all the money it's expecting to get in, and all the promises it's made, and all the loans it's put out, which it's expecting to get back, if all of that doesn't match all the deposits that people have left with it and expect to get back. So basically, what's happened is there are people who've left the deposits who expect money, there's people they've lent money to who expect money, there is this little thing that the banks have which is their own capital, and they have to have enough capital to withstand a gap in the assets. If the assets start to fail, then the bank's not going to get back in as much money as it hopes it's going to. And the capital base got very, very low. Some people have said it was virtually nothing in the American banking system. Some people have done calculations and said, really, the banks weren't holding on to any reserves at all, hardly. So the balance sheets just weren't matching up. But of course, it was just a balance sheet. It was just paper. So in fact, apart from the accountancy side of it, in fact, they weren't all running to get pound notes or gold coins, and therefore, to a certain extent, it could have been stenched. What's the word I'm looking for? Stemmed. And this is the problem with the European situation at the moment. There's not enough liquidity being put into the system to save the banks who are in fact threatened with insolvency. So are all banks as bad as each other then? Well, the Americans tried to separate out their deposit and their investment banks after the 1929 crash. But as we know, that sort of filtered away in recent years. And the early banks really didn't affect most people because ordinary people didn't have their money in the bank. They had it in building societies and places like that. But in fact, that sort of distinction, and there's still public banks, particularly in Germany, there are public banks. But in fact, all types of banks got caught up in the speculative buzz. So a lot of banks found themselves put in difficulties. Not everyone, but building societies got caught up. German public banks got caught up, as well as the private banks. So yeah, they all kind of got swept up in the fervour. So what happened over this period then is that states lost control of the money creation in the whole money system, particularly after the deregulation of banking. And we saw the inflationary effect of bank-issued money when they were vastly increasing the money supply. It didn't turn out in the price of bread, and it didn't bring people onto the streets. It turned out in vastly increased price of houses and commodities and the stock market, which all went very high. But that really was, they call it capital growth, but it was really just asset inflation. Now, the problem now is that the national money supply, because it's based on bank-issued debt, is subject to crisis. It can go into crisis at any time if people can't borrow or the banks won't lend. And we're in, as I say, we're in that at the moment. Now, it's plain that the public does see the banking system as a state responsibility. Because Northern Rock, I save, Ireland, with having to back all the banks, the Eurozone, where the governments are getting heavily involved, the IMF is having to come in. Plainly, when the banking system gets into trouble, it is not a private system any longer. It becomes the state's problem, and we've seen that quite clearly. We'll talk about that more next time. But we do know that states have had to take on sovereign debt to rescue private debt, because it's seen as if the states are the only safe haven in town for money. But ironically, the states, because they're not allowed to print their own money, are having to borrow from the same banks that are in trouble to help the banks that are in trouble. So it's quite ridiculous, this notion of the money markets. So, and states are even seen as responsible for this avalanche of debt. They're being called, particularly the British state, if you think of, this mess that Labour left us, as is being blamed. And it's not just, if it's been a right-wing government, it'll be the mess that the Conservatives left us. So the states are seen as responsible for the avalanche of debt, and there's so much more concern about national debt, which is not really a problem as much as the private debt. It's really people who are so indebted they can't manage. The states, until the crisis, as I said before, the states weren't doing badly at all, about 40% of GDP in national debts. So hence the austerity is falling on the population, which shows that we're taking responsibility for what's happened in the banking system. So the reason that we got in such a mess is because although there's this myth of real money and bank money, in practice it was impossible to distinguish the different types of money. There is no real money. There's no backstop here. All money becomes a public issue. And in fact, the whole banking and financial system becomes a state issue, because in a systemic crisis, the whole system has to be supported. Lehman wasn't a very big bank, and it was an investment bank. They decided to let it go bust, and it nearly brought the world system down, because all the banks were interconnected. The same with Greece. Greece is actually smaller, I think, even than Lehman's. As a country, is smaller than that, smaller investment bank. And yet it's in danger of bringing the whole system down. So you can't, it's only one system, and you can't let it fail in any area. And I think this is the lesson. The idea that you can get things small enough to fail, I don't think is true, because Lehman was small, relatively, and yet it couldn't fail. So the obvious thing we've learned is that state responsibility for the integrity of its money system means it continually has to bail out the privatised banking system. It has to. Otherwise, it has no money system, if you rely on just debt-based money issue from the banking system. And it's a major problem, obviously, for states if borrowings are in another currency. So that becomes a big issue. It's not so bad if it's in its own currency. And this undermines the public. We're getting to the state where we're losing any confidence. We're being told not to trust the state. The state has to rescue the money system, but we're told not to trust the state. So the public sector is seen as parasitic on the private money creating sector, and yet it underpins that sector. And that sector can't manage without it. And all money, as I've argued, is based on the concept of legal tender, which the state is underwriting. And in fact, states and monetary authorities have put huge support to their financial sector. Even in the early stages of this crisis, about 15 trillion worldwide has been estimated. And that was a couple of years ago. And countries have been bankrupted. They haven't got a GDP big enough to bail out their banks. Ireland's financial sector was 10 times GDP, UK 5 times GDP. RBS alone's balance sheet is as big as our GDP. RBS alone is as big as our GDP. So if RBS goes down, then it takes GDP with it. So the heart of the problem isn't banks too big to fail, banks too little to fail. The problem is that the debt-based money system demands constant money supply growth to repay debts with interest. And without that growth and people willing to take on debt and able to take on debt, the money supply will shrink. And hence my argument that a money system has to have somewhere in the system where money is issued that's not reclaimed by the issuer. It must be debt-free and tax-free state money or unpaid debt. Because in the end, that's the only way you'll get the excess money able to go into the economy is if people don't pay their debts. And now, of course, that's what's happening. People are defaulting on their debts, and they will. The notion of... And, of course, this is why in biblical terms, but in most early societies, they had the concept of jubilee. That is, that debts could only last a certain time. Debts could last 7 years or 50 years or so long. And after that, jubilee. Nobody owes anything anymore. And that's what a debt-based system has to do. It has to declare all debts null and void, and then you can start again. So what's the distinctiveness of the difference between the two circuits I've described, the state circuit, money issue, taxation, and the private circuit, money is debt, repaid with interest? The distinctiveness of state-issued money, and it is distinct. I know I've said before it's very difficult to identify it as this real money notion, but it is distinctive for one way, whatever form it takes, whether it's electronic or cash or notes or tally sticks or whatever, is that state money is not borrowed at the point of issue. It is just issued. And now, and therefore states can issue money debt-free because they don't have to make a profit. They are not a commercial sector. They are a state. They're like a babysitting circle. They're like the person who creates the babysitting tokens. The state money issue is debt-free at the point of issue. It might be issued as debt, as a policy decision, but it hasn't to be borrowed into existence. Now, all bank-issued money, because that's the way banks work, even if they're not for profits, they still have to issue everything as loan. They can't give money away. They issue money as loans, and it has to be repaid. So there, and money has to be issued for an economy to function. It has to be continually issued. So the point of issue, whether it's state money or bank money, something has to start the process. We have now, of course, gone back to a form of state-issued money. The government has issued state electronic money, quantitative easing, but it's done a funny thing with it. What it's done is it's let the Bank of England. It's said the Bank of England can create 275 billion now, isn't it? 275 billion pounds worth of money, but it's put it into an account which it is using to buy government debt back, which puts money into the economy, because lots of institutions are holding government debt. So it buys its debt back, which means those institutions have now got money and not the government debt, so they can start issuing that out. But instead of being treated as, well, that's fine, just cancel the debt, and that's the end of that, government, which would be a way of bringing down the government debt, no problem, it still kept it on the government's books as a debt, which is quite crazy. And what will happen is that eventually the Bank of England will sell that debt back out into the community and put the money back somehow, or that's what it'll do. It will sell the debt again or it will give the debt back to the government at some point to cancel its debt. So although it can make debt-free money, it's still got a conception of somehow within the accounting system of the Bank of England, it somehow has to be borrowed by the Bank of England from itself somehow. The upshot of the way it's done it is that it's put the money into as a sort of loan to the Bank of England, although the Bank of England's kind of lending to itself. But it's put it out in the form of buying back government debt into the financial sector, because that's who held government debt, to the insurance companies, the building societies, the banks, the pension funds, the banks. So, in a sense, it's gone into the organisations that aren't lending money anyway. Now, obviously, what you should have done with that money was put it straight into government expenditure, straight into infrastructure, straight into ways of getting the economy moving again. But that's not the way they look at it. That doesn't seem to enter their policy network. So my summary then is that the financial system is not private, it's a public system. It administers a public resource, money as legal tender. Its final resource, the only resource it has in the end, is the taxation, money issue capacity of states. That's all it has backing it in the end. And yet that system registers itself mainly offshore. It spends its whole time trying to avoid paying taxes. Yet the only thing that underpins that system is the tax base of states, and yet they undermine it by offshoring as much as possible. So they are undermining the capacity of states to rescue the very system that they are constructing. So I would argue that money should be seen as a public resource, that we should see money as a commons, as a social resource, like air or water as a natural resource. And we need to reclaim money as a debt-free public resource and issue it with democratically determined priorities. Money issue and banking should be a public service under public control. And as I'll argue in the last of the lectures, I think then we've got the possibility of creating a socially just and what I would call a sufficiency economy. But the economy we've got now is just in all ways not sustainable. It just cannot be sustained. Okay, thank you.